This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
The opinions expressed in the following programs are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers nor Rogers TV. This is Rogers TV.
So good evening. My name is Dr. Arlene McDougall, and I'm a psychiatrist as well as the Director of Research and Innovation for Mental Health Care at St. Joseph's Healthcare London. And I'm also the lead for MINDS, which stands for the Mental Health Incubator for Disruptive Solutions of London. So that's a local social innovation lab looking to develop new solutions for our mental health care system. I'm also a scientist at the Lawson Health Research Institute. I'm happy to be your host and facilitator for tonight's event. On behalf of the Lawson Health Research Institute, welcome to this Café Scientifique called Uncovering Trauma, a conversation about PTSD and moral injury. This event is made possible by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, known as CIHR. We also thank our media sponsor, Rogers TV, who will be sharing this event through their channel. For those who aren't familiar with us, Lawson is one of the leading hospital-based research institutes in Canada. We conduct research that advances scientific knowledge with the ultimate goal of improving health and health care for patients. We do this as the Research Institute of London Health Sciences Centre and St. Joseph's Healthcare London. As academic health organizations, both LHSC and St. Joseph's have care, teaching, and research mandates to fulfill. Lawson fulfills the research mandate of the hospitals, and our scientists work across the city. This means that our innovation happens where care is delivered. Every day, teams of researchers who are working directly with clinicians, with patients, and other partners to improve treatments or create entirely new ones. They find innovative methods of delivering services that drive efficiency and reduce costs. Lawson researchers, many of whom are healthcare professionals themselves, are tackling and solving important problems from a variety of fields and programs. This includes cancer, cardiology, children's health, imaging, mental health, neurological or brain disorders, orthopedics, transplantation, and much more. For the 12th year in a row, Lawson has been ranked top 10 in Canada, according to the 2022 edition of Canada's Top 40 Research Hospitals list by the Research InfoSource Group. This list analyzes hospital-based research institutes from across Canada based on several metrics, including total research income and research intensity measured by spending per researcher. So according to the report, Lawson has received just over $140 million in research income in just 2022 alone. Lawson is at the top of the list for research intensity among the large tier institutions across our country. This continued success is the result of the work of hundreds of people across our city who are dedicated to health research and improving health care. Okay. Sorry. In just a moment, you'll be hearing highlights of groundbreaking and specialized research being conducted by researchers and physicians right here in London. New data just released by Statistics Canada from the Mental Health and Access to Care Survey reported that in 2022, more than 5 million Canadians are experiencing some type of mental disorder. And the COVID-19 pandemic has shed light on the often hidden traumas faced by those in specific industries like healthcare, policing, and the military. Today, we will shed light on some of the new research in the area of mental health trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and moral injury, which you will learn more about shortly. We will also hear from people with lived experiences connected to trauma and how their lives have changed over the years. Now, I want to recognize that some of the topics related to trauma research discussed tonight may be difficult for some to hear and even triggering for some. So please know that there is a list of trauma resources and general mental health resources on your table. These are local resources as well as national resources that you can access. Please also, if you need to, just step out of the room and take a break. Café Scientifique is not a scientific lecture. It is meant to engage you in informal discussion. You will have the opportunity to discuss and further explore the ideas presented by our researchers and those with lived experience, as well as others in the audience. First, each speaker will give you a short talk focusing on what they do and why. Following a quick break, we will begin the discussion portion of the event. You should all have paper pads in front of you at the tables and pens so that you can write down any questions or comments that you may have. Please hold on to these so that you can ask questions during our discussion session. I also invite you to interact with us and others on social media during the event. We will be using the hashtag Lawson Café, and I encourage you to do the same. So, Lawson researcher Dr. Don Richardson was our first speaker of the night, but unfortunately, he couldn't be with us tonight. However, stepping in is his very close collaborator and exceptional scientist and researcher, Dr. Anthony Nazaroff. So Dr. Nazaroff is the Associate Scientific Director of the McDonald Franklin OSI, which stands for Operational Stress Injury, Research Center at Lawson, as well as a research scientist and adjunct professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Western University. His research is focused on mental health conditions that are common among veterans and how to better identify, treat, and prevent moral injury and related operational stress injuries. He has extensive expertise in this area, having previously worked for Canada's Department of National Defence. Please welcome Dr. Nazaroff to the podium.
So Dr. Don Richardson is not here, but the slides are here. So I'll do my best to do this justice. And again, it's a privilege to be invited. And if there's, thank you very much. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, I'll be happy to answer them either during the break or during the Q&A. So first, who are we? So the McDonald Franklin OSI Research Center was established in 2018, and we are the largest military and veteran mental health research center in Canada. We are a national and international leader. We have lots of partners around the world exploring initiatives related to well-being of veterans and veteran family members. We have expertise in operational stress injuries. So again, this is mental health conditions that may occur due to service in the military. So it could be post-traumatic stress disorder, it could be depression, it could be moral injuries, something that I'll unpack quickly today. Occupational trauma research, and resilience. So when I was with the Department of Defense as a defense scientist, my job was to understand and optimize psychological readiness for the Canadian Armed Forces. So we're affiliated with Lawson, of course, St. Joseph's Healthcare London, and Western University. So first, why is this important? So the work that I'll be discussing specifically relates to two projects that were pretty large scale on our front. Again, we have lots of different initiatives, but these are two that I wanted to highlight today. Our surveys related to COVID-19 impacts. So in March 2020, just like the entire world was trying to figure out what is happening, we were also doing work to conduct research to answer some of these pertinent questions. So at that point, and even now, we're still trying to understand what was the impact of the pandemic on the well-being of at-risk groups, such as Canadian veterans, of course, healthcare workers, family members of veterans as well. Throughout the year, in 2020, certain surveys were coming out to sort of highlight what's happening on the national level. So we noticed that 40% reported worse mental health status since the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. 20% reported increased alcohol consumption. But again, these are very general trends. We don't know what are the factors for a specific individual that makes things either puts them on a good trajectory, stable trajectory, or a worse trajectory. At the same time, we know that veterans are an at-risk population. So Canadian Armed Forces veterans are more likely to have mental health conditions compared to the Canadian general population, of course, due to aspects related to operational service. We do also know that there is significant social isolation in veterans as well that further prevents perhaps the bond and the social network that's so important in terms of sustaining positive well-being. At the same time, we notice significant changes in delivery of healthcare. In the veteran segment specifically, many veterans seek care, medical care. What we noticed is that because of the changes in how this care was delivered, there were significant changes in terms of care access, but at the same time, significant changes in terms of the providers and the impact that this pandemic had on the providers. Again, linking it back to the quality of care that the veterans were receiving. At the same time, we knew that the healthcare system was already strained even before the pandemic. I think the pandemic sort of opened up a new lens and a more sharp eye on this issue. We know that it's in a crisis. The pandemic definitely made it worse. We noticed high rates in healthcare, in burnout of healthcare workers, shortage of staff, nurses, physicians, all across the country. We're also aware that when we're speaking to veterans, they were concerned about the quality of care that they could be receiving as well. Moral injury was a key element in both cases, and this is maybe I'll take an opportunity to unpack this. Some of the research does go into moral injury, some of it is sort of general related to mental health, but I think this quote is pretty important, and I want you to keep it in your mind as I go through this definition, but the pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong, and I think that's very key as we try to unpack moral injury. And again, I'm a moral injury researcher, this is what I do for my career. So again, if you have any questions, I can unpack this and talk for days on this topic. So, but I'm on a sharp schedule, so I'll keep it relatively quick. Punchline is, definition is unclear. So we have lots of different disciplines over time trying to unpack what moral injury really is. Psychology, philosophy, social work, spirituality, all trying to figure out, well, what does it mean when we say we have a moral injury? What does it mean when I felt like I was morally injured? There are papers dedicated, teams dedicated, writing manuscripts to try to figure out what this definition should be. Why isn't it important, first of all, to define it? Well, if we can't define it, we can't really measure it, and we can't prevent it, we can't intervene on it. So this is a synthesis of what a definition of moral injury is, as we currently know it. So what you could do is maybe read this in a sentence, and you can switch up any of the phrases that are inside the quotes there in the brackets. So you could read it as psychological distress. Some people describe it as a character wound, spiritual wound, undoing of character, interpersonal crisis in response to the perpetration of, bearing witness to, failing to prevent, or learning about any event that transgresses deeply held personal beliefs, subjective moral standards, or this essence and belief of what's right and wrong. The key piece here is also aspect of betrayal. Betrayal is a component of moral injury. It doesn't neatly fit into this definition, but it's still a part of it. So betrayal of justice by a person of authority in a high-stakes situation. So maybe we can unpack this a little bit. What does it mean when we have a moral injury? I think very similar to PTSD, and you'll hear about this very soon. You have, let's say, a group of individuals. This group of individuals, they're exposed to a psychological trauma. Not everybody who's exposed to trauma will experience long-term adverse outcomes, right? So in terms of negative affect, for a prolonged period of time. This is very similar to moral injury. Just because you encounter some moral challenge or moral dilemma, that doesn't always mean that you're going to be distressed due to it for a prolonged period of time. Doesn't mean that you'll always have significant alterations in functioning in your daily life. When we talk about moral injury, I'll make this distinction pretty explicit. Moral injury are the outcomes related to that exposure. So just like, let's say you have a car accident, that is the exposure. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the outcome. In a similar sense, we can be exposed to these moral dilemmas and these moral conflicts. If we have negative reactions to it, it would be classified as a moral injury. So what does that moral injury look like? Well, you could have alterations in self-perception, so maybe the way that you view yourself, your identity, alterations in moral thinking, so appraisals of others, appraisals of your own behavior, changes in terms of what you think is right and wrong. You could also have changes in terms of moralism. Maybe, in this example, seeing things strictly as black and white. And again, this is a change, an alteration to how you were before this experience. Relational impacts, so that's loss of belonging, social isolation, difficulty or maybe lack of interest in maintaining new relationships. Emotional aftermath is definitely one of the more prominent pieces that are discussed with moral injury. Shame, guilt, very common, but I think because of that piece that I like to point to, the betrayal aspect, when we're betrayed, we don't feel shame and guilt. We feel anger, right? And I think anger a lot of times is forgotten, or at least not focused on. But you know, when we're talking about treatment, or we're talking about some sort of interventions, when we're trying to think, okay, well, who's in the team feeling betrayed, we shouldn't be looking at shame and guilt. We should be looking at signs of anger. Self-harm obviously changes in spirituality as well. There is significant overlap with what we know as PTSD. So you could also have issues sleeping, maybe hypervigilance, avoiding certain cues about trauma. So where we are currently, moral injury is not a medical diagnosis. Post-traumatic disorder is. But what we're seeing now is that moral injury is a thing. It's something, but it's really not captured in sort of the purview of the clinical setting until recently. But moral emotions are normal, right? So this is probably a really good visual of representation in terms of how you could go from, let's say, moral challenges that we all experience every day. It took me 3 hours to drive from Toronto. I experienced a lot of moral challenges when people cut you off on the highway, right? Like you feel that anger, again, the betrayal of a system that everybody should follow, right? But those are fleeting emotions. Like you maybe say some bad words and then you move on, right? So moral challenges leading to moral frustrations. Moral stressors leading to moral distress, and morally injurious events leading to moral injury. And as you go down to the right on the spectrum, what you're seeing is that this increase in degree of mental, social, spiritual harm and impairment. And chances are, if you're exposed to something that's morally injurious, it's likely going to be low population prevalence. So not that many people are going to be exposed to it. Of course, it's very common in the population that we're seeing in veterans, right, because of specific deployments. But it's typically not as common in the civilian setting. And this is exactly why a lot of work in moral injury came from the military setting, research within the military setting, whereas moral distress, slightly less severe, but same idea, actually came from a healthcare setting. So a lot of work looking at experiences of nurses, burnout, aspects related to a lack of resources when you have competing priorities and patients, but limited supplies. So again, where moral distress ends and moral injury begins, we don't really know. And what we're trying to do is now figure out, okay, well, how do we get there in terms of when is the right time to intervene? When is it okay to let things take its natural course? Who can be impacted? Well, really everybody, but if you try to target a population, it's going to be individuals who need to make difficult moral ethical decisions in high stakes environments. So no wonder this research happens in military personnel, healthcare workers, first responders, even the legal system. But again, nobody's off limits, really. How are we on time? Good? I'll assume that's good. 5 more minutes, okay, excellent. So we did do very specific research related to the well-being of veterans and healthcare workers. Again, noticing that they're at-risk populations. We did a lot of work to make this happen. So what we tried to do is we aim to capture the impact of the pandemic on the well-being of veterans, spouses of veterans, and healthcare workers. Whoops. What we also wanted to do is identify trajectories of well-being over time, because it's understanding the change. That's really where the magic happens in terms of understanding what is something that changed in a person's life that creates this mechanism that we can maybe follow to understand, okay, well, if it worked for you, maybe it'll work for others. So what we did was we launched a survey in 2020, and we just recently finished data collection, where we had individuals, again, we're in the thousands here in terms of individuals participating. Very hard to reach out to the community, very hard to convince individuals to participate in this research. Online surveys, we tried to make it as convenient as possible. And we asked individuals to answer maybe 20 minutes of surveys every 3 months. And we did that for 1.5 years. We looked at mental health symptoms, we looked at family functioning, we actually had spouses of veterans and veterans advising us. Some of them are actually here in this room, advising us in terms of what should we be capturing when we're collecting this data. So what are the key results? What we found was that first we needed to understand who actually participated. We noticed that, for the sake of time, I'll forward the slides a little bit. We noticed that over half the individuals, veterans and veteran spouses, mentioned that their well-being was worse now than before the pandemic. Over 30% met probable criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Over 30% met criteria for depression, generalized anxiety disorder. Alcohol use was also a significant issue. And again, suicidal ideation was present in about 20% of the sample. And as we're sampling in, this population, again, we try to make it as representative as possible. We could cross-section this survey in many different ways. One of the ways that we tried to look at this is, well, who was exposed to COVID, whether they themselves or within the family. And we noticed that there were significant differences in depression, in post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, in alcohol use among those individuals who had experienced COVID infections within the family versus those who didn't. Again, sort of highlighting that if that did occur in the family unit, they were more likely to be struggling. So some of the takeaways here is this is really just the first look, because what this is looking at is initial responses. So we understand that individuals were suffering. We noticed significant rates of depression in this population, anxiety, PTSD. Loneliness was definitely a huge issue. Problematic alcohol use. This was related to exposure to COVID-19. And what we noticed, there were some signs of positivity. We noticed that whereas some individuals definitely struggled over time, most individuals were actually healthy. Right, so that's definitely a positive because we can learn just as much from individuals who are doing well, just like we can learn from individuals who are not doing so well. Many individuals started using telehealth during this transition at the pandemic, and many actually mentioned that they would like to continue using telehealth going forward. Again, significant implications as we discuss these results with policymakers related to access to care in terms of how medical care should be provided to veterans and families. And just really quickly, we had a parallel study of healthcare workers. Burnout was a significant issue, and again, we see that very commonly in like Globe and Mail articles, et cetera. But we started this research back in 2020 and we started seeing that. What we're doing now is trying to unpack it to figure out what are the signs and predictors of burnout in healthcare workers. One of those important things is what are they experiencing in the workplace? So what we actually provided was a list of potentially morally injurious experiences that a healthcare worker may be exposed to. And what we found was pretty staggering. Almost 80% of the healthcare workers, again, hundreds of individuals, were mentioning that they significantly lacked administrative action for a problem that was compromising care. Watching patients suffer because of lack of provider continuity. Lack of resources, obviously that was definitely in the media. Excessive documentation requirements that compromised care, and fear of retribution if they spoke up about issues. So again, significant issues there that we're trying to unpack to figure out, okay, they were exposed to this, it was very frequent, what kind of an impact did it have on their mental health, and potentially even organizational factors. So we looked at, I'll skip this one, you can ask me questions in terms of what we looked at, but one piece that was so staggering was that we looked at their intention to leave the job. We know that we have trouble having healthcare workers stay in their positions, significant attrition. So what we looked at is, can we predict individuals who would actually be leaving their jobs? And we could actually model this, and the strongest predictor was the degree of moral injury that they're experiencing. And most of it was sourced from betrayal, right? This anger, the cynicism, burnout, because the organization, it was perceived like they didn't have their backs. So the strongest buffering to that intention to leave the job was good leadership. So if individuals were exposed, if individuals were in teams that had strong leadership, even in hard times, they will continue to push through and stay. And that creates a significant lever that we can actually use, right? Because it's one thing to look at this information, but it's another thing to actually action on it. So one piece that we're doing is we're trying to understand the mechanisms of, okay, so there are some individuals that are getting worse, getting better at each of these at-risk groups. Can we understand what those predictors are? Because maybe some of those predictors could be opportunities to intervene. And then most importantly is, can we maybe reframe how we support individuals, right? There's this analogy of you could treat sick frogs over and over and over again, but maybe we should be looking at where they are located. Maybe they're in a toxic pond, right? So maybe we should be focusing on the pond that's there instead, and working to detoxify that as well, because maybe it won't be sustainable as the pond creates all these sick frogs. So that's exactly what we're doing with a REVEL initiative. So the initiative is called REVEL. We're funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and we're very proud to partner with St. Joseph's to actually implement this initiative at the hospital with significant leadership buy-in from the top down. And what we're trying to do is refocus and rebalance the interventions that are provided to healthcare workers. Again, soaking up everything that we know about resilience from the military perspective, from first responders, et cetera, and trying to apply it to the healthcare industry to, again, prevent the crisis that is occurring. So rebalance the focus from the individual to the organization, to leadership and the team, and then embrace the dual continuum of mental health. So really briefly, I know I'm probably over time. I see the nods. So a typical model of mental health could be going from healthy, let's say green, to red, ill, right? So let's say at the ill stage, you'll be getting a diagnosis. So you could have potentially a diagnosis of schizophrenia. But is it the job of the organization to manage that condition? Not always, right? So if somebody has depression, that doesn't necessarily mean that the organization is responsible for your place where you are in from healthy to ill. What we need to be looking at is flourishing versus languishing, right? So on top of this aspect of absence or presence of a mental health condition, you could have schizophrenia and flourishing at your workspace. Or you could have an absence of a mental health condition. Maybe you're not depressed. Maybe you don't have a diagnosis of PTSD, but you could be languishing in the environment that you're in. And again, with prolonged sort of exposure to that, you're more likely to transition to that red zone. But when we open up this sort of perspective to look at this dual continuum, so healthy to ill, but also flourishing to languishing, you open up opportunities in terms of intervention. And that's what we're building with REVEL, is a toolkit for organizations, specifically in healthcare, to try to apply this to support healthcare workers. And the most important thing that we're doing in terms of supporting veterans is taking all the lessons that we're learning in terms of this initiative and feeding it back to the military, because a lot of the work that is the foundation of this actually comes from the resilience program that the Canadian Armed Forces creates for military personnel. So I'll leave it at that. Apologies if I'm over time, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nazarov. I didn't ever think frogs would be so apropos when we're talking about healthcare and the environment. So our second speaker tonight is Larissa Lamrock. She is the National Strategic Advisor for Families at Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families, and Veterans Family Advisor on the McDonald Franklin OSI Research Center Advisory Council at Lawson. Larissa has extensive experience in the field of family peer support with anxiety, PTSD, and depression. She is also the daughter, spouse, and mother of former and currently serving Canadian Armed Forces members. And she strongly believes in the importance of education and support for families of military members, veterans, and first responders living with operational stress injuries. Please welcome Larissa to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Lawson Institute for the opportunity to participate on tonight's panel. I will be sharing a very brief scenario, which might be upsetting to some, but it's not graphic or detailed or anything. I love a broken soul. My husband served 24 years in the military and completed 7 deployments, including 2 tours to Afghanistan. He has seen and experienced extraordinary things that have made him a more empathetic and compassionate person. Other extraordinary things he experienced have left scars on his soul. Nobody who serves in uniform is superhuman. They're often exposed to traumatic and horrific events with which the rest of us are oblivious to, the toll that it takes, unless you are the family member. When I was younger, someone close to me, a veteran, was diagnosed with PTSD. It was before the term became sexy and before it was a common storyline in popular culture. Information, support, and education wasn't offered to family members on how to support their loved ones. I became an advocate and took it into my own hands to educate myself on PTSD, seek out research, and occasionally invite myself to doctor's appointments. I became an expert caregiver. PTSD has been called an invisible injury. You can't tell just by looking at someone if they're living with it. But for family members, there can be signs. I became highly attuned to my husband's behaviors and moods, perimeter checks of buildings, his head on a swivel in crowds, and triggers like a drive-through. I eventually started to mimic some of the symptoms of the diagnosis myself. Hypervigilant to his triggers, hyper-aroused to his symptoms, and avoidant of situations that might make him uncomfortable. This invisible injury doesn't just impact one person. Over time, I started to notice that the strategies I adapted to support him with his PTSD were only effective in certain instances. I felt helpless as I watched guilt, shame, inner conflict, and distress slowly erode his being, and I began to suspect that something more than PTSD was happening. This wasn't just a psychological injury. What he struggled with was deeper, in his core, in his soul. One of my husband's tours took place in the Balkans. Soldiers perform many tasks on deployments. It's not what you might assume from the movies. There's mundane maintenance and chores that have to be done to keep the camp running and functional. Feeding troops and meal preps, as you can imagine, is high on the list. For whatever reason, on many occasions, too much food was ordered and needed to be disposed of. Now, it might seem logical to us that the food should be passed on to the local people, many of whom were starving. But as our time here today is too limited to explain all of the intricacies and factors, I need you to appreciate that there's too much complexity to war and conflict that we civilians simply don't understand. As there wasn't enough food left over to provide to the whole community, sharing it with only a small group would put them in incredible harm and likely death from other locals who desperately needed to feed their own families. During this particular tour, my husband was under strict orders to repeatedly take the food and dispose of it at another location, which required him to drive past elderly people and children who were clearly starving. Consider yourself in this dilemma. This is the type of experience that can result in a moral injury. Would it break your soul? What I have observed as I learn more is that moral injuries are extremely intimate and personal. Veterans often don't disclose the events that leave them struggling with guilt and shame. They isolate themselves as they struggle with their own self-worth and self-loathing. This distancing often leaves them on the periphery, not understanding why their loved ones are receding. Without information and education on moral injuries available to families, many are not even familiar with the concept of a moral injury. So many family members are left feeling helpless on how to help their loved ones, or they internalize this distance as a reflection of their own self-worth or the quality of the relationship with the veteran. I've talked about how families can be put into a caregiver role, or they can experience secondary symptoms of trauma, or feel disconnected from veterans that they love. But I'd like to introduce another perspective of my experience that I know that I am not alone in as the spouse of a veteran. I am changed by my loved one's service. Please let me be clear that I'm extremely proud of my family member's service. My father also served, and I take pride in identifying myself as a veteran family member. I know what tours my spouse did, what his role as an infanteer entailed, and I've been keen to listen to him when he shared his experiences, the good and the not so good. So over the years of listening to various veterans' experiences, I'm aware of some of the grim realities of what happens in countries ravaged by war by other countries. It's what I call humanity's inhumanity. It can be really difficult to fathom and accept. So bearing in mind that I don't have the training and experience that soldiers do, or the specific context, details, or considerations of an event that is relayed through the lens and the perception of the veteran, this secondary exposure to various events has led me to question my own beliefs about the world and humanity. The world doesn't work as I once believed. It's shifted my own moral compass. I'm curious what those of you attending tonight's event anticipated you would hear from the spouse of a veteran. In my professional experience as an advocate for veteran families, most considerations for us are as an extension of the care team or support team for the veteran. As we urgently try to meet the needs of military, veteran, and first responders living with trauma, families are often overlooked. Panels and events that are solely based on military, veteran, and first responder families are incredibly rare. I believe the field of military, veteran, and first responder mental health needs to do better and focus on and consider the potential of family members' experience of trauma and moral injuries independent of the person in uniform. As I hope I've made you all aware, PTSD and moral injury are family injuries, so we need to consider and support each the veteran and the families. To extend this train of thought further, I'm curious what consideration has been given to the intergenerational impact of moral injury on children of those who serve. Although I'm not an academic or a clinician, I do understand that children's moral development and schema are influenced by the beliefs, values, and views of their parents. Let's go back to my husband's tasking during his deployment to the Balkans. Although he wasn't intentional or conscious of it at the time, his injury started manifesting itself in how he parented his daughters, who were around 2 and 5 years old when he returned from tour. Throughout all of their developmental years, they had to eat everything on their plate. They were not allowed to complain, and they were minimized in regards to their emotions. After all, in relation to starving children in the Balkans, what did they have to complain about? Now, as adult children of a veteran, they can be hard on themselves and critical. They feel guilty and selfish at times when they shouldn't, and it's affected their choices and how they eat. This is all directly related to the moral injury that my husband experienced. Although we're starting to gain a better understanding of the effects of PTSD on families, including vicarious trauma and secondary PTSD, the effects of moral injury on families is less clear. I don't think we can eradicate PTSD or moral injury. We can't inoculate the soul. In fact, perhaps what makes us human is that our souls and hearts are susceptible to breaking. But as a veteran family member, as an advocate, and as a mother, I want to better understand these mental health injuries and the effects on families. I rely on researchers to help investigate and present information that will improve treatments, supports, and outcomes, and will inform policy, change, and practice so that families supporting those with PTSD and MI will no longer be overlooked. However, to ensure research is effective, relevant, and doesn't make presumptions, research needs to engage lived experience, including family perspectives. I'm currently a co-principal investigator as a person with lived experience with Dr. Deborah Norris on a study focused on the experience of adult children of veterans, which is also guided by a lived experience advisory committee. Co-design, co-creation, and engagement of lived experience with the idea that both the academic perspective and lived experience are equally important to a project's success can be critical in ensuring a strong study design, execution, and the dissemination of findings that will be most pertinent and meaningful to the community. What does it mean to love a broken soul? It means finding new ways to love a person who has been fundamentally changed by their traumatic experiences and accepting that you yourself may now view the world in a different way. It means continually trying to resolve things that have challenged your own moral schema, even though you are not the one in uniform. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Larissa. I think I speak on behalf of all of us. Thank you for sharing your experience and your family's experience, and for all of your advocacy and engagement in research to make it better for others. Thank you. Our third speaker tonight was supposed to be Lawson researcher Dr. Ruth Lanius. Unfortunately, Dr. Lanius was unable to be with us tonight. However, we're so happy to welcome Brianne Kearney, her PhD student, who's been working very closely with Dr. Lanius in her lab on her innovative research. So Brianne is a doctoral student in the Department of Neuroscience at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University. And she also is an occupational therapist, so she holds a Master's of Science in Occupational Therapy, as well as a Master of Research degree. Her focus is on how the body and mind interact after trauma, and how to treat trauma using the body and mind connection. So please welcome Brianne to the podium. Thank you.
All right. So Dr. Lanius is not one to enjoy people singing her praises, but I will anyway. So Dr. Lanius has really been a pioneer in understanding the neurobiology of post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as understanding dissociation and really acknowledging the dissociative subtype of PTSD. And so tonight I'll talk a little bit more about on the PTSD side of things, as well as how moral injury can be an impetus for the development of PTSD. So we live in a world full of stressors and potentially traumatic events, and this is on a global scale, from the European refugee crisis to the war in Ukraine. And of course, it hits close to home as well. So our military veterans returning, our first responders, as well as our healthcare workers, especially those that had to endure the COVID-19 pandemic, and our Indigenous peoples. And so we've talked a lot today about how we can be exposed to certain events and not necessarily develop a disorder or a condition. But in order to be diagnosed with PTSD, which is the prototypical diagnosis after a traumatic event or events, are a cluster of symptoms. And so we'll go through these just so we're all on the same page. I'm sure many of you already know. The first is re-experiencing the event, and this means instead of remembering the past, we really relive it, like we're right back in that moment again, and we have very vivid sensory and emotional details that come up just like we were right back there in the moment. Understandably, and a very, very adaptive response is to avoid any potential reminders of the event, to avoid these distressing symptoms from coming about. There's also negative alterations in our cognitions and moods, such as pervasive feelings of guilt and shame, as well as changes to our arousal, which often manifests as hyperarousal, so startle responsivity, increased hypervigilance, difficulties sleeping, difficulties paying attention. And these symptoms must cause significant functional impairment, meaning it gets in the way of our ability to maintain our relationships and to function in our day-to-day lives. And so on top of these symptoms, about 30 to 40% of individuals will also experience what's called dissociation. And this can manifest either as depersonalization, where we feel separated from ourselves and our bodies, as well as and/or derealization, where we feel like we are removed from our external environment. And the dissociative subtype has been highly correlated with early life trauma, which hasn't been talked about as much tonight, but early life chronic traumatization, as a kind of an adaptive response to inescapable threat. Our body shuts down so we don't have to feel. So why do we care about PTSD? So for one, in any room full of 100 people, 8 of those people will develop it at some point in their lives. So that's a significant amount of people. There's also a great economic burden of PTSD, and so it has a greater burden on our healthcare system than any anxiety disorder and depression. It also, in Canada, there is an annual productivity loss of about $3 billion. So I won't go into too much detail about moral injury since we've already had an expert up here talking about it, but it can be an impetus for the development of PTSD as well. And so we know that moral injury can also occur really with pervasive feelings of guilt, shame, and a sense of betrayal. And those who have moral injury-related PTSD will also have those additional hyperarousal symptoms, re-experiencing symptoms, etc. And so we know that this is not a black and white situation. There's a lot of overlap between all of these conditions: substance use, family conflict, depression, PTSD. And so I'd like to just bring everything together to a common theme where we can start thinking about how to provide the proper treatments for these individuals, given that it's a very gray area. So we know that 50% of people who go to the treatments that are recommended still are not responding. And a common line that's said is that I know it wasn't my fault, but I can't stop feeling it. It keeps tearing me up inside. And so this has been a topic of interest in our lab, and understanding why in our logical brain we can say these things to ourselves, but then our body is feeling something very different. And so looking at the brain from a more evolutionary perspective, we have different layers that have evolved over time. And so our main focus really here is looking at this what's called reptilian, or a survival brain, in our brainstem and our midbrain. And this is the part of our brain that reacts without thinking. So it's very adaptive to have a very quick response to threat, to sudden danger, where we don't have to utilize the resources in our upper brain. We can react and protect ourselves. And then over the course of human development, we've developed higher level capacities in our limbic or our emotional brain, as well as our neocortical brain. And this is where we're able to control our impulses. We can pay attention, we can shift our attention, we can read other people's emotions. And so in a healthy brain, these different parts or layers of the brain are very interactive and very dynamic. And then what's happening in PTSD, or what we were studying, is that this more reptilian or survival brain is really overactive in PTSD. And it's adapted because of past traumas in order to keep us safe in the present and the future. And so one key area of this brainstem and midbrain area is called the periaqueductal gray. And so this little region, oops, I won't do that yet. This small region here is very small, but very important and very multifaceted. So it integrates our raw, visceral, affective emotions, such as fear and rage. And these are emotions that we call more primitive because we share them with most other animals. And so this part of the brain also elicits our quick defensive responses when we go into fight or flight without having to think about it, or emotional shutdown, where we feel completely physically and emotionally numb, such as in the dissociative subtype of PTSD. And so the work I'm presenting here today was done by Dr. Braden Turpow. So he was another PhD student in Dr. Lanius's lab. And so he investigated the activation of the PAG when people were presented with a word that was related to their trauma. And we saw an increased amount of activation in the PAG relative to controls. So then the group went a bit further to say, okay, how is this area of the brain communicating with other parts of the brain? And so that's called functional connectivity. We look at how the activation time course of the periaqueductal gray is similar to other parts. And what the group found was that there was an increased communication with what we know as the default mode network. So the default mode network is a group of brain regions that communicate together, and they're highly active when you close your eyes and you just let your mind wander. And so it's very implicated in how we come up with our memory narratives. We might think about what we did earlier in the day, what we did early in our lives. It's also active when we're thinking about our future. And so it gives rise to a sense of a continuous self. And so what was found was that the periaqueductal gray was more highly connected when people were remembering their traumas in PTSD. And additionally, further research found that directionally, the PAG was driving this disruption in these higher cortical areas, so a bottom-up process. And so the interpretation here is that the periaqueductal gray and all these raw visceral emotions and defenses that are coming online are kind of hijacking the sense of self, and it's disrupting our memory processing. And it's giving rise to thoughts and self-related beliefs, and it could be things like, I can't trust anybody. The world is completely dangerous. I'm not safe. So a lot of our work has been focused around uncoupling the default mode network from the survival brain, from the PAG. And so this has implications for treatments and for the development of new treatments that are more focused on lower levels and bottom-up processing. As I've mentioned before, only 50% of people across studies tend to really respond to the current gold standard treatments out there. And dropout rates are about 1 in 5 or 20% of people. So there's something that's too distressing about going to therapy for a lot of people. And so one of the novel neuroscientifically guided treatments that we're currently studying in the lab is called deep brain reorienting. And this is a form of trauma processing it's a form of psychotherapy that targets this deep brain circuitry. And so this is the brainstem mediated sequence that I'll go through each step. And DBR was developed by Dr. Frank Corrigan, and he's a psychiatrist and psychotherapist in Scotland. So the first response that is elicited before we're consciously aware of it is an orienting response. So we see a stimulus in our environment that our brainstem picks up as important or threatening, and the orienting response prepares the muscles of the head to turn towards or away before we're aware. And so another really important area of this survival brain is called the superior colliculus, and it has very close connections with the PAG. And so we know Dr. Brian Corneal, who's actually at Western, did a lot of work on this in monkeys and saw that the superior colliculus, when you stimulate it, it results in head and eye movements to orient. And so this brings on a brief orienting tension in the neck and head. And in DBR, this orienting tension is really critical for maintaining the individual's awareness of their body in time and space. And this attenuates the rest of the sequence so the person does not become overwhelmed. Once we're lengthening out and deepening into this tension, shock. So the next part of the sequence for some individuals is imagine yourself stepping out into a road and a bus whizzes by, and before you're able to think or feel, a surge of energy pulses through your body. And so DBR is the only current psychotherapy that addresses this shock response and uses the orienting tension to allow it to be fully expressed. And it's thought that the development of post-traumatic stress disorder could be in part due to the interruption or disruption of this shock response. We didn't fully process what happened. And so we have this traumatic realization, like I'm going to be assaulted, I'm gonna be hit by the bus. And this is thought to be mediated by the deeper layers of the superior colliculus and the PAG's connection with the locus ceruleus. And this is another survival brain or brainstem area that we know to be the seat of noradrenaline or norepinephrine production. And this is our fight or flight response, and it floods our brain. And so in order to fully process this, the therapist keeps having the individual maintain their sense of awareness through the orienting tension and allows the shock response to clear. And only then can we arrive at a more regulated ability to process our raw emotions. And so this is where our PAG activation comes into play. And the hypothesis is, if that we decrease this hyperactivation of the PAG, we can have more upstream effects on the higher levels of the brain and improve these disruptions that are going on, especially in the default mode network. And so just to reiterate, the DBR sequence here, this neck and face tension from the orienting tension from the superior colliculus helps process affect and prevent that emotional overwhelm or dissociation response, which is a really huge barrier to a lot of people that try to go to other forms of therapy. They become too overwhelmed, they dissociate, and they cannot benefit from it. And so we currently have a randomized controlled trial of DBR that we're running in our lab. So we have individuals who have PTSD, and this includes people who have moral injury-related PTSD, because we're really focusing on those deep, raw, emotional, affective situations for any individual suffering from post-traumatic stress. And so we have 8 sessions of online-based DBR as compared to 8 weeks of a wait list. And we're assessing clinical measures before and after treatment or wait list, as well as at a 3-month follow-up time point. And these measures are looking at the severity level of post-traumatic stress, PTSD, looking at depression and physical symptoms. We're also having our participants have an fMRI scan before and after. And so at Robarts, we have a 7 Tesla scanner, and this has a higher spatial resolution. So we're able to really hone in on these really tiny, small brainstem structures of interest. And so some interim findings just on our clinical measures are pretty striking, in that we're seeing a significant difference between our DBR group and our waitlist group after those 8 sessions. And this is being maintained at a 3-month follow-up time point. And these effect sizes are pretty large, which is quite promising. There's also a 95% retention rate, meaning not many are dropping out of treatment. So that's also very promising in that it may be a well-tolerated treatment. And I'd just like to end on a more uplifting and positive note. So one of our participants who received DBR after the treatment said, instead of the memory coming from a gaping wound, it's coming from a projector in my mind. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight and welcoming me in place of Dr. Lanius and all of my lab members.
All right, I think we're now all neuroscientists, right, after that talk. Very exciting research, Brianne, that you're doing with Dr. Ruth Lanius. Thank you. Okay, so our 4th speaker is Teresa Kinney. Teresa is a research participant who has contributed to studies with Dr. Lanius. She experienced extended trauma at a young age, but was not diagnosed with PTSD until she met Dr. Lanius. She credits much of her improved mental health to the clinical work and research performed by Dr. Lanius. Please welcome Teresa to the podium.
Hi, I'd like to thank Lawson Research for inviting me to do this, and Ruth for dragging me into this. Actually, Ruth doesn't usually need to drag me into these things because I feel events like this and a lot of the education that I do is extremely important. It's extremely important for healthcare workers to hear from the perspective of a survivor. And I'm going to talk about a forgotten group, an often forgotten group, when it comes to PTSD, and that's children who experience developmental trauma. And so my diagnosis, when I finally got to Ruth, I'd been in the system for 15 years, and there really wasn't a safe person, not a safe doctor, not a safe therapist for me to disclose to, until I met Ruth. And my diagnosis was complex developmental post-traumatic stress disorder and a dissociative disorder not otherwise specified. I like that, not otherwise specified. I don't know where it goes, but I can tell you what my experience of it was. So I met Ruth in about the year 2000. She wasn't even a real doctor yet, okay? She was still a student. She had 3 weeks to be a real doctor. And I like to say we grew up together in this field. And so when I first met Ruth, I was not very well. I had spent probably 8 years of that 15 years in hospital, including a 1-year stay in a hospital. In hindsight, I don't think that hospitals were beneficial. That is my perspective, certainly at the time. But I think it taught me, we talk about a toxic pond, and I think hospitals can be a toxic pond for people. So I hope I'm not offending anybody. My PTSD, and I realize there are people here who have PTSD, and I'm hoping this isn't too triggering, so please take care of yourself in this. I was gang raped repeatedly for a period of 4 years. I was then sexually assaulted within weeks of starting college. I had moved out west to go to college and then followed up with university. I ended up losing a year of university before I was able to go back and finish my degree. When I met Ruth, I had no hope. And I had really taken on what I felt from a lot of people who provided care for me, a lot of doctors in specific, who seemed to say, well, I needed to do this and I needed to do that, and I was resistant, treatment resistant. Well, that sends a huge message to someone who already doesn't think a whole lot of themselves. When I met Ruth, one of the first things she said was, okay, let's go, it's time to cure you. And she had that hope, and I said to Ruth, I said, you hang on to that hope because right now I don't have it. I'll let you know when I want it back. And so I started working with Ruth. I did groups, which I hated, by the way. I was in the very first DBT group run by, it was at South Street Hospital at the time. And every time, after every meeting, I went to Ruth and I said, I don't want to go to group anymore. And she said, you're going to group, Teresa. And I said, no, I'm not. We had this fight weekly. For the first 6 months, I didn't speak in group. So I think I've come quite a long way at this point, because here I am. So we started treatment, and Ruth is a researcher as well at heart. And I have done probably almost 100% of her studies. I'm probably a little short in doing all of them. And I believe research is important. I believe that finding different ways to treat is important, because what was being used didn't work. And I know a lot of people with developmental trauma. I know veterans with trauma. I know healthcare workers with trauma, so I know a lot of people who've experienced trauma. And I've seen the results in families as well, as Larissa was speaking. I've seen the results of friends of mine whose children have grown up in an environment where the parent has PTSD. So I think that research is extremely important in moving treatment forward. I think the brain is a brilliant mechanism, because without my brain, I wouldn't have survived, right? My brain did lots of great things at the time that allowed me to survive what was really no child should experience, no child should go through. There were no safe people to go to. It wasn't like I could talk to anybody because there were lots of threats being made. So you're in this world and your brain does these incredible things. My safe place wasn't in my body. Oh, no, no, no. The body is not a safe place for trauma survivors, okay? So what is safe is outside of your body. And so I developed a dissociative disorder, and my favorite place to go away to was a willow tree, where I could sit, and what was happening to what was on the ground wasn't me, but it was a shell of a thing. And so I developed dissociative disorder, and mine isn't a complete dissociative identity disorder. And again, there's lots of doctors who don't believe in this, so this was problematic as well. But what happened was, parts of me, I had lots of different parts that carried anger, parts that carried certain memories, there was some overlap. Unlike a person with dissociative identity disorder where there's zero overlap. What I knew, but what I never told anybody, including Ruth for the first 5 years I knew her, was that I was hearing voices in my head. They weren't outside my head, they weren't coming from the TV, they weren't coming from a radio like someone with schizophrenia might experience, they were in my head. So they called them pseudo-hallucinations. Yeah, so like they weren't real, okay? So, and I learned to work with those parts. And so it's been a process. I still see Ruth today, but I don't see her all the time. I see her, hey Ruth, I need to do a piece of work, can I come back and see you? We do a piece of work and I say, bye Ruth, and continue on with my life. I can speak to both moral injury and to deep brain reorientation. I've done deep brain reorientation, where I'm focusing on my neck and head. Again, not a favorite thing for people with PTSD to be in their body, especially if there's someone who feels their body betrayed them, okay? Survivors of sexual abuse are often feel their body somehow betrayed them. You felt things that you didn't think you should have, and things happened that you didn't think should have. So with deep brain reorientation, there's not a whole lot of talking going on. I'm focusing on my neck, I'm focusing on my shoulders, and the tension there. And then I'm processing. I also did EMDR, so I still do a bit of tapping even though I'm not really doing EMDR. It's a soothing thing for me. So I find that this deep brain reorientation has been really helpful in moving through some of the deeper, the long-term issues that have been difficult for me to address. As far as moral injury, I can speak to people with PTSD can also experience moral injury, okay, outside of someone who's never had an illness or someone who might develop PTSD because of a moral injury. And about 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago now, I was able to travel to China to work in China and teach English. And when I was in China, I saw a young child, maybe 2, maybe 3, being beaten with a stick by her grandmother. I was horrified. And I had made a promise to myself as a child that I would always be available to any child in need, okay? And people dragged me away from that. I wanted to intervene. And they wouldn't allow that to happen because it was unsafe for me, okay? It's not like being in this country. It would be an unsafe situation for me, and they're dragging me away. My friend who was teaching with me in China saw the same thing as me. She didn't remember this. I didn't forget it. And so I really felt like I had betrayed myself in not acting to help that child, because I made that promise when I was a child that I would always be available to a child in need. And so that's a different look at moral injury. I am still impacted by that today. However, I'm able to see that there was really nothing I could have done that wouldn't once again have put me in danger. And thankfully, I had friends who were bright enough to pull me out of that situation, because I couldn't have done it myself. I would have gone to try and help the child. But in some ways, I still felt like I had betrayed myself and the promises that I made to myself. And children with children with developmental trauma make lots of promises to themselves about how things are going to be different. And when we can't carry them through, it hurts. It causes so much guilt, so much shame. All that guilt and shame you already have from your PTSD diagnosis, all that exists around that comes flying back in your face. And it's like being hit really hard. And so I did the first steps of this study. Sometimes I'm like Ruth's guinea pig. And so I often will be the first person doing a research study with her. And I did the beginnings of this moral injury study with her, including the MRI. And I was really shaken after that, and it took me a while to get myself reoriented. So I think that there's lots of benefits to this, to research into moral injury. I think it needs to be recognized that people who already have PTSD can also experience moral injury, and it can be a huge trigger for them. Okay, it might, you might see a reawakening of symptoms in that person that have long since been resolved. PTSD doesn't solve itself overnight. This has been I was 20, in my early 20s, probably 21 when I was first hospitalized. I am almost now 18. No, I'm almost 60 now, so it's almost been a 40-year journey. For the most part, I'm fully functional. I now have a job. I've been teaching English as a second language for 14 years, and I'm still surrounded by trauma because I teach refugees. So I see the results of these wars in my students, and I hear what happened to my students. And like Larissa, I question humanity every day. A couple of years ago, I had a class of almost completely Yazidi women who had come to Canada. And if any of you have done any reading, these are probably some of the most traumatized people I have ever met in my life. And every day they would tell me their stories, leaving out no detail. Why? Because teachers spend 5 hours a day with these students. They know you, they trust you. And so, as much as I tried to help, and as much as I could relate to the symptoms, I started to experience now vicarious trauma. And I had to remove myself from that situation. And so the following year, I started teaching at a different school. I did not lose touch with those students. I still have contact with his students. I've seen how they've grown. I see how they've changed. And I consider myself lucky to have been one of the people to initially meet them in Canada and to be able to work with them, because I could provide some tools for them. Tools that I had used myself, tools that I'd been taught. And so I could provide that to them. So I think that both research is really important from a intervention perspective, and that's why I take part in the studies. I do not think that putting a person with PTSD in an MRI machine is necessarily a fun thing. Okay, you put them in this MRI machine, you put a mask on their face, you take their glasses away and they can't move. Wow, okay, let's be re-traumatized. Sort of reminds me of things, right? So while I hate the idea of it, I love that it results in answers, and that's why I continue to participate in those studies. On the other hand, I believe that education is extremely important, and I believe that people need to hear from survivors. I would like to see, I know there's been a lot of talk about veterans tonight, but really, children who have survived trauma have lived with it their entire lives. And so I often call us the forgotten group, because the media likes to talk about veterans, first responders, and nobody's talking about the kids who survived. And so for me, I understand it's a difficult topic. Nobody wants to hear or believe about sexual abuse or physical abuse or neglect of children, right? It's better to just, we'll just turn that off and pretend it doesn't exist. It's easier that way for people, just like we've done with our Indigenous community, okay? Just like we've done with our Indigenous, we'll turn it off, we'll pretend like it didn't happen, we won't acknowledge it. But this has a lasting effect on a survivor as well, because it plays into that not being seen, not being heard, being quiet. You don't talk in group for 6 months because you don't want people to see you. You don't want people to know you're there. You want to be invisible. I learned that as a kid. You need to be invisible, okay? Today I'm much better. Robert walked up to me at the beginning of thing, snuck up on me over here and asked me if I wanted water, and I jumped. My startled response never goes away, and people ask me all the time. I also don't think that my sleep will ever come. I take 3 different medications to sleep, and I said to Ruth just a few years ago, I will always need medication to sleep. Sleeping is just not a safe thing to do. Okay, sleeping is not safe to do. So your eyes are closed, you're not aware of your surroundings, so sleep can be a lingering impact of PTSD. I could speak for 3 hours, but I know we all have a time frame, and I'm sorry, Amanda. Please, if you have any questions for me later, I'm open to answering them all. I've experienced most symptoms, I've attempted suicide, I've self-harmed, I've done it all in the spectrum of what happens to survivors. But I'm a survivor, and I have to thank my brain for that. And I don't like to think of this as a disorder. I like to think of this. I'm not into labels and things like that. I don't care if you call it a disorder, whether you just want to call it post-traumatic stress. What I know, and it took me a long time to figure this out, is that my brain was incredible in allowing me to survive. And I think that we need to continue the work we're doing in order to move forward and to be more helpful to people so they don't languish in hospitals for 15 years before they find someone. And I know that wait times are incredibly long for people. You hear 6 months, yeah, that's on the low end. Okay, I know people who have waited 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before getting treatment because it's not available. So please, if you have any questions when we get back together, feel free to ask them. I'm open to most questions. I'll tell you if I'm not. And I think it's break time. Okay, let's take a break. And thank you.
Just slide in.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much, Teresa.
watching Rogers TV. Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
I don't care what the law is. I will never be a slave. That word, I hate it. It rests on my tongue like rot.
Peter, how does it feel to get paid for your work?
There are rumors freedom's coming for us all.
Freedom, you know that's all I want.
Chloe, careful. Vrooman would rather sell you across the river to America than let you go free.
Then I'll run.
I've run before. Maybe this time for good.
No! No! Just get her into a boat. No!
Chloe! Chloe, no!
Word of Chloe Cooley's resistance led to Canada's first legislation limiting slavery. After 200 years, slavery was abolished in Canada in 1834.
Come on in, take a seat. Or better yet,
Look at this crowd on its feet.
for aggressive D and knockdown threes, athleticism and speed, for Spicy P.
Spicy P. Feeling it on the big stage.
Yes, this season brings change. Yes, this team has turned the page. But it's still an OG thing, always a Scotty B thing. When you want everything Raptors, nothing but Sportsnet.
Most people that are have received treatment for drug use problems are probably going to have a lapse.
Join addictions counselor Dean Anderson for Invisible, Breaking Through the Stigma of Addiction on Rogers TV.
Today, I helped a parent feed their family by connecting them to a food program.
Today, I helped someone connect with mental health supports.
Today, I helped a couple struggling to pay their bills access financial aid.
Every day, 211 navigators connect Canadians to critical government and community programs and services.
211. Help starts here.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Mario Elia, and I'm the host of a new show here on Rogers TV that we're calling Keeping London Healthy with Dr. Mario. So tune in Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. and we'll see you then.
I started with Rogers TV back in the summer of 2021. So I went to journalism school, so I had more experience on the other side of the camera, and so I thought getting some behind the camera experience would be better for career advancement. Some of the things that I've learned as a volunteer is how to set up the cameras, how to tear them down, how to set up commentators' headsets, things like that. I'd say just go for it. There's no really commitment for hours. You get the opportunity to meet a lot of great people, and you get to cover some great events. What it means to be a volunteer with Rogers is you get to connect to the community in ways that people don't necessarily see, like with hockey games or racing or baseball, things like that. I'd say yeah, just go for it. It's a lot of fun. You meet a lot of great people, and it's just a great time.
Do you have questions about menopause and the menopause journey? We've got you covered. Join us for the Modern Woman's Menopause Show, and hopefully we can give you some answers. And of course, my friends, don't forget to sparkle.
Game TV's Watch and Win contest is back with over $75,000 in cash prizes. Tune in to Jeopardy weeknights at 8:30. Spot the code word, then head over to GameTVContests.com to enter. With a new code word every weeknight, that's 35 chances to enter. Don't just watch the winners, be a winner with Game TV's Watch and Win contest. Contest runs October 16th to December 1st. Visit GameTVContests.com for more info.
About 16% of the people we talked to actually became homeless during the pandemic. And it's a horrible thing to be.
After a night out with your friends, not having a plan for a safe ride home can leave you